The chair creaked once, then went still. No one in town had ever seen him like that before. The Apache sat slumped slightly to one side, long dark hair falling across his shoulder, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. His hands that had once gripped reins through dust storms and held steady in moments of danger, rested loosely on the worn wooden arms of the chair. He was asleep, not the kind of sleep a man takes lightly. Not the kind where one ear stays open and the body remains ready to spring. This was something deeper, heavier. The kind of sleep that only comes when exhaustion finally overpowers pride. The afternoon sun stretched low across the quiet town, spilling gold over the dusty road and catching the edges of old buildings that had seen too many hard seasons. A dry wind passed through, stirring the hem of his coat and carrying with it the faint scent of earth and distance. Still, he did not wake. From behind curtains and half-closed doors, people watched. They had always watched him. Some feared him, others respected him. Most simply kept their distance. He was not a man who belonged to their world, and yet somehow he had become part of it. A quiet presence, a shadow at the edge of town. A man who spoke little, asked for nothing, and gave even less away. And now he was vulnerable. "Is he really asleep?" someone whispered from the doorway of the general store. "No man like that sleeps out in the open," another voice muttered back. "Not unless he's pretending." But there was no pretending in the way his shoulders had dropped, no tension in the stillness of his jaw. The lines of his face, usually sharp, guarded, had softened into something almost unfamiliar. Peace. Or maybe just the absence of a fight. Minutes passed. No one moved closer. Because even in sleep, he carried a presence that warned people away. A lifetime of survival does that to a man. It builds walls that remain standing even when the man himself finally rests. A child took one step forward from behind his mother's skirt. "Don't," she hissed, pulling him back quickly. "Leave him be." The boy looked up, confused, but he looks tired. The woman didn't answer, because the truth was, he did, more than tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something far too heavy for far too long, and had finally, for just a moment, set it down without realizing it. The wind shifted again, slightly stronger this time, brushing against his face. A loose strand of hair moved across his cheek. Still, he didn't stir. It was strange, almost unsettling, to see someone so strong, so still. Time stretched, and then from the far end of the street, someone began to walk forward. Not fast, not hesitant either, just steady. She wasn't like the others, who hid behind distance and caution. She didn't whisper or glance around for approval. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead, her steps measured, as if she had already made her decision long before anyone noticed her moving. In her arms, she carried something, folded carefully, held close. A quilt. The fabric was worn at the edges, its colors softened by time, but still holding traces of care in every stitch. It wasn't something meant for display. It was something that had been used, loved, kept. The townspeople noticed her now. "Where is she going?" someone murmured. Another voice lowered, uneasy. She shouldn't go near him. But she didn't stop. Each step brought her closer to the man in the chair, closer to a silence that felt almost sacred. The sound of her footsteps faded as she reached the wooden porch. The boards creaked softly beneath her weight, but even that small noise didn't wake him. She paused, just for a moment, standing there, looking down at him. From this close, she could see what others couldn't. The faint shadow beneath his eyes, the way his breathing carried a quiet heaviness, the small details that told a story no one else had bothered to read. This wasn't just sleep. This was a man who had run out of strength to keep standing. Her grip tightened slightly around the quilt. Behind her, the town held its breath. No one dared to interrupt. No one dared to call her back. Because something about the moment felt different. Not dangerous, not reckless, but deeply human. The kind of moment that doesn't happen often, and when it does, it demands silence. The Apache shifted slightly in his chair, a faint movement, almost instinctive. But he didn't wake. And she took one final step closer. Close enough now that she could reach him, close enough that she could turn back. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there, the quilt still folded in her arms, her eyes lingering on the man everyone else only knew from a distance. And in that quiet space between them, between fear and understanding, between past and present, something unspoken began to take shape. The town watched, the wind stilled, and the moment waited, just before everything would change. Long before anyone in town noticed her walking toward the sleeping Apache, she had already learned how to live quietly, almost invisibly. People knew her name, but they rarely used it. It had been easier, over time, to refer to her in passing, the woman at the edge of town, the seamstress, or simply her, not out of cruelty, but because grief had a way of reshaping a person, until even their identity felt softer, less defined. She hadn't always been that way. There was a time when her home had been filled with sound, laughter that spilled through open windows, the clatter of dishes shared between two people who didn't mind the noise, the low hum of evenings that stretched long, where stories were told not because they needed to be heard, but because they were worth sharing. And in the center of it all, there had been warmth. The quilt had begun during those days. It wasn't meant to be anything extraordinary at first, just scraps of fabric gathered over time, pieces from old dresses, worn shirts, and small fragments of life stitched together slowly, patiently. Each square carried a memory, though she hadn't realized it then. Back then, she stitched without thinking, without knowing that one day every thread would matter. There had been someone who used to sit across from her while she worked, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. A presence more than anything else. Strong hands that would occasionally reach over to hold a piece of fabric in place while she threaded the needle through. A quiet voice that would tease her gently when she lost count of her stitches. A smile that didn't need to be seen to be felt. Those were the days when time moved differently, when tomorrow was expected, when nothing felt fragile. But life, as the town had learned too many times, doesn't ask before it changes. It happened in a way that didn't feel real at first. Loss rarely does. One moment everything is where it should be, and the next something is gone in a way that cannot be fixed, replaced, or understood. The house grew quiet. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that settles into walls and stays there. She remembered the way the light had looked different after. How even the same sun that once warmed the room now felt distant, like it belonged to another life she could no longer reach. People came at first. They brought food she didn't eat, words she couldn't hear, sympathy that felt heavy in her hands, like something she didn't know where to put. Then, slowly, they stopped coming. Not because they didn't care, but because grief makes others uncomfortable. It reminds them of things they would rather not face, and so they stepped back, leaving her alone with something they could not share. That's when the quilt changed. It was no longer just a collection of fabrics. It became something else, a way to hold on to what was slipping away. She finished it in silence, her hands moving through memory rather than thought. Each stitch became slower, more deliberate, as if rushing would cause something to disappear entirely. When it was done, she didn't celebrate. She simply held it, folded it carefully, and placed it somewhere safe. Not to be used, not to be seen, but to be kept, because it was the last thing that still felt whole. Years passed, or maybe they didn't. Time has a way of losing meaning when each day feels the same as the one before it. She learned to live around the absence, to wake up, work, and rest without expecting anything more. She spoke when necessary, nodded when spoken to, and avoided the places that held too many echoes of what used to be. The town adjusted to her silence, just as it had adjusted to the Apache's presence. Two lives moving along the edges, never quite touching, yet somehow existing within the same quiet understanding. She had seen him before, of course. Everyone had. The way he rode in without announcement. The way conversations shifted when he passed. The way people gave him space not out of respect alone, but out of uncertainty. He was a man shaped by something no one here fully understood. And yet, she recognized it. Not the details, not the stories, but the weight. Grief has a language of its own. It shows itself in posture, in silence, in the way a person carries themselves when they think no one is looking. She had seen it in him the first time their paths crossed from a distance. The same guarded stillness, the same quiet separation from everything around him, the same look of someone who had learned how to keep going, but not how to feel whole again. That's why on this day, when she saw him sitting in that chair, finally still, finally unguarded, something inside her shifted. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't impulsive, it was something that had been building quietly over time. A recognition, a memory of what it means to carry too much for too long. Her eyes had lingered on him longer than usual, not with fear, not even with curiosity, but with understanding. And then, without fully realizing when the decision had been made, she turned back inside her home. The quilt was where it had always been, folded, untouched, waiting. For years she had kept it safe, as if using it would somehow erase what it represented. But as her fingers brushed against the fabric, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to think before. Memories don't disappear when they are shared. They live differently. Quietly she lifted it, held it close for just a moment longer than necessary. And then, for the first time since she had lost everything, she carried it outside. Not to hold on to the past, but to offer something from it, to someone who, whether he knew it or not, needed it just as much as she once had. She didn't realize when standing there became deciding. One moment, she was simply watching him, like everyone else in town, standing at a distance where it was still safe to turn away. And the next, something had shifted inside her, quiet but certain, like a door opening without sound. Her fingers tightened slightly around the folded quilt. It would have been easy to leave, to step back down from the porch, return to her small house, and place the quilt exactly where it had always been, untouched, preserved, protected from the risk of meaning something new. That's what she had done for years. That's what she had trained herself to do. Hold on. Do not give. Do not reopen what barely held together. Behind her, she can feel the weight of the town's gaze. Even without turning, she knew what they were thinking. He's dangerous. He doesn't belong here. You don't know what he might do. Those thoughts weren't cruel. They were cautious, built from stories, from distance, from the kind of understanding that comes from never getting close enough to know the truth. For a moment, doubt brushed against her. Her eyes dropped to the man in the chair. He hadn't moved. The rise and fall of his chest remained steady, slow, as if the world around him no longer demanded anything at all. Up close, the sharpness people feared seemed to fade into something else, something quieter, heavier. Not threat, not violence, but weariness. Her breath caught, almost without reason, because she had seen that before. Not in him, in someone else. Someone who used to sit across from her, long ago, in a home that no longer felt like it belonged to her memory alone. She remembered the way exhaustion had looked then, not as weakness, but as the final stage of holding on too tightly for too long. The way a person's guard doesn't drop because they trust the world, but because they simply can't carry it anymore. That kind of moment is rare and fragile. It shouldn't be interrupted. It shouldn't be exposed. It should be protected. The thought came to her clearly now, settling into place with a quiet certainty that surprised her. He shouldn't be left like this. Not because he was helpless, not because he needed saving, but because she knew what it meant to finally, accidentally, let go. And how cruel the world could be when it noticed. Her grip on the quilt softened. This wasn't just fabric. It was everything she had refused to give away. Years of holding on, years of silence stitched into something she could fold and hide. And now, she was standing here, considering placing it over someone she didn't know, someone the town feared, someone who had never asked for anything. Her heart beat slower, heavier, not from fear, but from the weight of the choice. Because this wasn't about him, not entirely. It was about her, about what it meant to finally take something she had guarded so carefully and let it serve a purpose again. A quiet voice rose in the back of her mind. If you give this, you cannot take it back the same way. Not the quilt itself, but what it represents. She swallowed. The porch beneath her feet felt suddenly more solid, as if grounding her in the moment she could no longer avoid. She could walk away. No one would blame her. No one would question it. She would return home, fold the quilt, and continue as she had always done, living carefully, untouched by risk, untouched by change, but still alone. Her eyes lifted again to the man before her. There was something about the way he slept that unsettled her. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was honest. A kind of honesty most people never allow themselves to show, especially not in front of others. He had not chosen this moment. It had taken him. And for the first time since she had known of him, he was not guarded, not distant, just human. That was when it became clear. She wasn't walking toward a stranger. She was walking toward something she recognized. Grief, loneliness, the quiet endurance of someone who had lost more than they could ever explain. Her shoulders eased, just slightly. The hesitation that had held her in place began to fade, not all at once, but enough to move. Behind her, a voice whispered again, sharper this time. You shouldn't. But the words didn't reach her the way they were meant to. Because she wasn't thinking about danger anymore. She was thinking about the nights she had sat alone, holding that quilt in her lap, wishing just once that someone had understood what it meant, without asking her to explain it. No one ever had, not truly. And maybe that was why she couldn't turn away now. Not when the same silence stood in front of her, breathing, existing, unnoticed for what it really was. Her hands shifted, unfolding the edge of the quilt slightly. The fabric caught the light, soft and worn, carrying years within its threads. For a brief second, she closed her eyes, not in fear, but in acceptance of what this moment meant, of what she was about to give. When she opened them again, there was no hesitation left, only a quiet resolve. She stepped closer, not rushed, not reckless, just steady, as if each step was something she had already taken long before today. And, when she finally stood beside him, close enough to hear the faint rhythm of his breathing, close enough to see the stillness of a man who had finally stopped fighting sleep, she understood something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in a very long time. Sometimes, the smallest act is not about changing someone else's life. It's about allowing your own to move again. Her fingers lifted slightly, the quilt ready in her hands, and in that silent space between who she had been and who she might become, she chose to give. The moment didn't rush her. It waited. As if even time understood that what she was about to do could not be undone, and should not be hurried. She stood beside him now, close enough to feel the quiet warmth of his presence, close enough that the world behind her, the whispers, the warnings, the watching eyes, faded into something distant and unimportant. There was only this: the man in the chair, the quilt in her hands, and the space between them. For a heartbeat, she simply listened, not to the town, not to her thoughts, but to him. The slow, steady rise of his chest, the faint sound of breath that carried no tension, no readiness, no guarded edge. It was the sound of someone who had finally, completely let go, if only for a moment. It stirred something deep within her. A memory of nights long ago when she would sit in dim candlelight, watching someone she loved drift into sleep, just like this, when the world felt safe enough to rest. When she had believed, without question, that such moments would last. Her fingers tightened around the quilt. For years, she had kept it folded away to protect that feeling, to preserve it. Because once something that meaningful is used again, it changes. It becomes part of the present, not just the past. And the past had always felt safer, untouched, unchallenged. But standing here now, she realized something that settled into her chest with quiet certainty. Memories are not meant to be hidden forever. They are meant to live, even if it means risking their shape, even if it means letting them become something new. Her hands began to move. Slowly, deliberately, she unfolded the quilt with care, as if each layer deserved to be acknowledged, respected. The fabric fell open in soft, familiar folds, revealing the pieces of a life she had once lived, stitched together in patterns no one else could fully understand. The edges were worn, softened by time. The colors had faded, but not disappeared. They held on, just like she had. The breeze caught the corner of the quilt for a moment, lifting it gently, as if testing its weight in the world again. She steadied it instinctively, her grip firm but gentle, her touch guided by something deeper than thought. This wasn't just an action, it was a crossing, from holding on to letting go, from silence to offering. She took a breath, and then carefully she reached forward. The first contact was barely there, the edge of the quilt brushing against his shoulder, light enough not to disturb, but real enough to exist. She paused immediately, her eyes fixed on him, searching for any sign that she had gone too far. A movement, a shift, anything. But he didn't wake. His breathing remained steady, unbroken, trusting in a way he didn't even know. Her hesitation softened, encouraged not by certainty, but by the absence of rejection. Slowly she continued. The quilt settled more fully now, draping across his shoulders, falling over his chest, covering the quiet rise and fall that had drawn her here in the first place. She adjusted it instinctively, making sure it rested comfortably, as if this were something she had done 1,000 times before. Perhaps, in another life, she had. The fabric conformed to him easily, as if it had always belonged there, as if the years it had spent hidden away had led to this exact moment. Her hands lingered just a second longer than necessary, not because she doubted the act, but because she felt it, the weight of what she had just given. Not just warmth, not just comfort, but something far more fragile. Something that had once been shared only with someone she had loved and lost. And now, without words, without permission, she had offered it again, to a man who knew nothing of its history, and yet somehow understood its meaning, because even in sleep there was a quiet acceptance in the way he remained still beneath it. No resistance, no rejection, just presence. She drew her hands back slowly, careful not to disturb the moment she had just created. The quilt rested securely now, its edges falling naturally, its warmth settling into him, as if it had been waiting for this purpose all along. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, looking at him, at the way the hard lines of his face seemed softer now, touched by something unseen. At the way the world, just for this instant, had allowed two separate lives to overlap without conflict, without fear. Behind her, the town remained silent. No one spoke, no one moved, because something about what they had just witnessed didn't belong to them. It wasn't an act of bravery. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't even kindness in the way they understood it. It was something quieter, deeper. a recognition that passed between two people who had never spoken, but somehow shared the same unspoken language. The language of loss, the language of endurance, the language of knowing what it means to carry something heavy and still keep walking. She stepped back then, just one step, not retreating, just giving space, allowing the moment to settle fully, without her presence altering it any further. The quilt remained, draped over him, a silent offering, a bridge between past and present, between what had been and what might still be. And for the first time in years, as she stood there with empty hands, where something precious had once been held so tightly, she didn't feel like she had lost anything at all. She felt lighter, as if in giving something away, she had finally made room for something new to enter. The wind passed through again, softer now, carrying with it a stillness that felt different from before. Not empty, not heavy, but calm. And beneath the quilt the Apache slept on, unaware that in this quiet, fragile moment, everything had already begun to change. At first, it was only a shift, so slight that no one would have noticed if they hadn't already been watching so closely. Beneath the quilt, his fingers moved. Not with urgency, not with alarm, just a small, instinctive response, as if his body had begun to recognize something unfamiliar before his mind could catch up. The breeze had changed, or maybe it was the warmth. Something was different. His breathing, once deep and even, altered by a fraction. A pause between one breath and the next, then a slow inhale, as though he were rising through layers of sleep that had held him down for longer than he intended. The town held its breath with him. From doorways, from windows, from the edges of the street where no one dared step closer, they watched, waiting, because this was the moment they had all feared. The moment where the quiet would break, where the man they did not understand would open his eyes and remind them why they had kept their distance in the first place. His hand tightened slightly against the arm of the chair, then relaxed. Then slowly, he stirred. His head shifted just enough for the light to catch his face differently. The shadows that had softened his features began to recede, revealing the familiar lines, strong, guarded, carved by years that no one here had witnessed. His eyes opened, not all at once, not sharply, but slowly, like a man returning from somewhere far away. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply looked ahead, unfocused, as if the world in front of him needed time to become real again. The silence deepened, because even now, there was no anger, no sudden movement, no reaction that matched the fear people had carried for so long. Just stillness. Then he felt it, the warmth. His gaze dropped, almost instinctively, to his chest, to the unfamiliar weight resting over him. The quilt. His brow tightened slightly, not in anger, but in confusion. One hand lifted, slow and deliberate, brushing against the fabric as if testing whether it was real. His fingers pressed into it gently. The texture, soft, worn, not something new, not something placed carelessly, something that had been kept for a long time. His hand stilled there, resting against it. And then, as if guided by something deeper than thought, his eyes lifted. He saw her. She hadn't moved far, just a step back from where she had stood before, her hands now empty, resting loosely at her sides. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't retreating. She was simply there, waiting, not for approval, not even for a reaction, but for the moment to settle into whatever it was meant to become. For a second, their eyes met, and everything the town expected to happen didn't. There was no flash of anger, no demand, no rejection, only a long, quiet pause. His gaze held hers, steady and searching, not in suspicion, but in recognition, as if he were trying to understand something that couldn't be explained with words, something he felt before he understood. The quilt shifted slightly as he adjusted in the chair, sitting more upright now. It stayed around his shoulders, draped naturally, as though it had already been accepted by his body before his mind had decided what to do with it. His fingers tightened once more in the fabric, not gripping, just holding, testing the reality of it, testing the meaning. Because no one had ever done this for him. Not here. Not in this place where distance had become the rule and silence had replaced connection. No one had crossed that space before. No one had stepped close enough to offer something without asking for anything in return. His eyes returned to her again, and this time there was something different in them. Not confusion, not caution, but a quiet awareness, as if he understood, without needing explanation, that what she had given him wasn't just warmth against the wind. It was trust. And trust is not something a person gives lightly after loss. The air between them shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could name, but enough to change the weight of the moment. Behind her, someone whispered, barely audible, "Is he going to?" But the words faded before they could finish, because there was nothing to interrupt, no anger to calm, no danger to escape. Only two people standing in a silence that no longer felt empty. He looked down at the quilt once more. His hand moved across it slowly, almost unconsciously, tracing the lines where fabric met fabric. His thumb paused on one of the stitched seams, pressing lightly, as if feeling the time that had been placed into it. He understood something then. Not the details, not the story behind it, but the weight. The kind of weight that can only come from memory, from care, from something that had once mattered deeply, and still did. His grip softened. He didn't remove it. He didn't push it away. He simply let it rest where it was, accepted. A small movement, but one that carried more meaning than anything he could have said. When he looked back at her again, the hardness people feared wasn't gone, but it had shifted, opened, just slightly, enough to let something else exist beside it. Respect. Not loud, not spoken, but clear. She didn't move closer. She didn't speak, because she understood that some moments don't need to be filled. They need to be held. And so they stood there, separated by only a few steps, but connected by something far deeper than distance, while the town around them slowly began to breathe again. The tension that had gripped every watcher loosened, though no one fully understood why. Nothing dramatic had happened, no words exchanged, no visible change, and yet everything felt different. Because the man they had feared had not rejected what was given, and the woman they barely noticed had done something none of them had ever dared to do. She had crossed the space between them, and he had allowed it to remain. The wind passed through once more, gentle now, brushing against the edges of the quilt where it rested over his shoulders. He didn't pull it tighter, but he didn't let it go either. And, in that quiet, fragile acceptance, a beginning took shape. Not in words, not in promises, but in something far more rare. Two lives, long defined by silence, finally acknowledging each other. Nothing changed all at once. That's what made it real. There were no sudden conversations, no dramatic gestures that turned strangers into something more overnight. The town woke the next morning as it always had. The same dusty road, the same quiet routines, the same cautious glances passed between people who preferred things predictable. And yet, something had shifted, not loudly, but undeniably. He came back to the chair, not immediately, not as if pulled by something obvious, but later that same day, when the sun began to dip and the air softened, he returned to that same spot on the wooden porch, and he sat. The quilt was with him, folded this time, resting across his lap, his hand placed over it, not gripping, not guarding, just there, as if its presence no longer needed explanation. People noticed. Of course they did. They always noticed him. But now their curiosity carried a different edge. Less fear, more uncertainty. As if they weren't sure what they were seeing, or what it meant. "Why does he still have it?" someone murmured quietly. No one answered, because no one understood it. Except her. She didn't approach him that evening. Not right away. She watched from a distance at first, standing just outside the edges of the moment. She had already changed. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, no longer holding the quilt, no longer clinging to something she once believed she could never release. There was a lightness in her now, subtle, but real. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was guarding something fragile inside herself, because she had already shared it, and somehow it hadn't broken. When she finally stepped forward, it wasn't with hesitation, but it wasn't bold either, just natural, as if the distance between them had already been crossed the day before, and this was simply the next step in something neither of them needed to name. He noticed her before she reached him, not by turning sharply or reacting with surprise, but in the way his posture shifted slightly, acknowledging her presence without needing to confirm it. He knew she was there, and this time he didn't look away. She stopped a few steps from him, not too close, not too far. The space between them was still there, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt respectful. He glanced down at the quilt for a brief moment, then back at her. A silent exchange passed between them. Not a question, not an explanation, but something simpler. Recognition. Her eyes softened, just slightly, not with expectation, not with hope that something more would follow, but with quiet understanding. Because she knew what it meant that he still had it. He hadn't returned it. He hadn't discarded it. He had kept it. And in doing so he had accepted more than just the warmth it offered. He had accepted the meaning behind it. Neither of them spoke. Words would have felt too heavy here, too clumsy for something that had grown so naturally in silence. Instead, she moved toward the empty space beside him, slowly, giving him time to object, time to stop her, time to remind her that some distances should remain. But he didn't. He remained still, present, allowing. She sat down. The wooden bench creaked softly beneath her weight, the sound breaking the silence just enough to make the moment real. They sat side by side now, not touching, not speaking, but not alone. The wind passed through gently, carrying the faint scent of dust and evening air. The same wind that had once felt cold and empty now seemed to move differently, softer, quieter, as if it had nothing left to disturb. Minutes passed. Neither of them rushed to fill them, because for people who had spent so long surrounded by silence, this kind of quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar, safe. At one point, his hand shifted slightly on the quilt, not pulling it closer, not offering it back, just adjusting it so it rested evenly between them. A small movement, almost unnoticeable, but intentional, and she understood. Without looking at him, she let her hand rest gently near the edge of the fabric, not touching his, not claiming anything, just close enough, sharing the same space, sharing the same warmth. The town watched again, but this time there was no tension in their gaze, no expectation of conflict, only a quiet confusion that slowly gave way to something else. Acceptance. Because what they were witnessing didn't look like danger. It didn't look like something that needed to be stopped or questioned. It looked human. Two people shaped by loss in different ways, choosing, without words, without promises, to sit beside each other instead of apart. Days turned into something softer after that. He returned to the chair often, and more often than not, she was there too. Sometimes first, sometimes after. They didn't plan it. They didn't speak of it. It simply became a rhythm, a quiet agreement that neither of them needed to define. The quilt remained between them in those early days, not always draped over him, not always unfolded, but always there. A reminder of what had been given, of what had been accepted, of what had begun. And slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, something inside both of them began to change. The weight they carried didn't disappear. Loss doesn't work that way. But it shifted. It became something shared instead of something endured alone. And in that sharing, it became lighter. Not gone, but bearable. One evening, as the sun dipped lower than usual and painted the sky in quiet shades of gold and fading light, he did something different. He spoke. Just a few words. Low, simple, but enough. Enough to break the silence they had both lived in for far too long. She listened, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just present. Because she understood that healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in moments, small, fragile, and deeply important. The kind of moments that don't erase the past, but make space for something new beside it. And as they sat there, no longer strangers, no longer entirely alone, the town around them slowly began to see what neither of them needed to explain. Some people are not meant to fix each other. They are meant to find each other, to sit in the quiet, to share the weight, to remind one another that even after loss, there is still something left to give.